Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's interesting to me that it's such a slow news day between gay marriage rulings, the potential for World War III in the Ukraine, and here I am talking about good government in our ad district, which is something that impacts every community in Kentucky. Let me start by saying that today I am releasing a special examination of the Bluegrass Area Development District, and my office began investigating financial activity and other issues at the ad after hearing concerns last summer, having conversations with the new leadership at the ad district, having conversations with elected leaders like Representative Susan Westrom in the neighborhoods that she represents. The exam reveals an agency with rogue management that conducted activity far outside its scope and without proper oversight, used federal money for questionable purposes, and failed to report potential criminal activity to law enforcement. Now let me be clear, lots of ads do good work, and this one is one of those that's included. And while we're not here to talk about petty thievery that you've seen in some of the work that I've done before, most notably with the former Commissioner of Agriculture, I need you to hang with me because this is a sophisticated and complicated system that was built. It was complicated because it was designed to facilitate abuse, waste, and fraud. And the move by the new leadership to end those days, to provide a clean break, I think is something that we can all applaud. It contains 8 findings and several recommendations for improvement. Due to the seriousness of these matters, it will be referred to the Kentucky Attorney General, the Kentucky State Police, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the United States Department of Health and Human Services, the United States Department of Labor, the Kentucky Department for Local Government, the Kentucky Cabinet for Health and Family Services, as well as the Kentucky Education and Workforce Development Cabinet. For those who aren't familiar with the Bluegrass Development District or other area development districts, they were created to assist local governments in Kentucky in regional planning in order to support economic growth. The Bluegrass ad is located in Lexington and serves 17 counties here in central Kentucky. It has an annual budget of $24.4 million, 90% of which comes from federal and state sources. For over a decade, the previous leadership of the Area Development District took advantage of the fact that the average citizen in Kentucky wasn't paying close attention to its functions and probably didn't even understand exactly what a development district does. It strayed far from its mission and seemingly convinced itself that because it doesn't receive direct payments from taxpayers, that it doesn't have to be held accountable. But let me be clear. Every penny this agency receives is a public dollar, and today is the day we begin holding it accountable. One of the most serious findings in the exam is that a former executive director of the development district tried to halt an internal investigation identifying potential criminal violations and did not report those possible violations to law enforcement. Violations which potentially include both theft by deception and forgery. The exam found that a former development district employee collected money from felons who were participating in the development district's felon reentry program known as Step Into a New Beat. The program, however, was federally funded and did not require a fee. The money wasn't accounted for in ad funds, so auditors were unable to determine how much was collected or what it was used for. Even more concerning is the exam found that individuals who believed that they were participants in the program were encouraged to sign consents for drug testing, even though drug testing wasn't required. We can't determine why this occurred. The examination also found that at least 8 people housed in a location under contract with the development district to support and provide housing for Step Into a New Beat participants had not been enrolled at the program at any time. This created a questionable federal cost of more than $6,400 for just 1 year. Folks, we're talking not just about questionable use of federal dollars, but what appears to be the exploitation of individuals who are trying to re-enter society. Not only did the former ad administration not report these suspected activities to law enforcement, it tried to quash its own internal investigation. Further, auditors found that the former employee accessed the ad offices while she was on administrative leave, and I believe took 300 files containing personal information of those who were participants in the Step Into a New Beat program. The ad did report this activity to police once the files were noticed as missing. The investigation found several organizations either created by a former ad director or other individuals that appeared to be mechanisms to expand into activities far beyond its scope. The ad looks like an octopus, extending its tentacles far beyond its original statutory authority. And I would point out that this is important because in a time and a place where we need all our governmental institutions to stay in their lane, to manage their resources, it's deeply troubling that you see any governmental entity get beyond its scope and frankly use it as an approach to abuse taxpayer dollars. One relationship that was a cause of concern is the Development District's relationship with the Bluegrass Industrial Foundation. The Industrial Foundation was incorporated by a former ad executive director as far back as 2002. The ad and the BIF have been audited together, and they also share board members. The issue here is that the ad has been leasing its office space from the Industrial Foundation since 1994, paying more than $250,000 a year. We found that most of the money used to buy the building came from the ad itself, raising questions as to why the ad didn't buy the property for itself. The lease payments were made for more. The lease payments that have been made would more than have paid off that building multiple times. When you consider that the building's value originally was purchased at $1.6 million and $250,000 a year, just even over the last number of years, we could have built an important asset that could have been used for the public. And in my view, what the Bluegrass Industrial Foundation can do to make this right is they can give the ad the building that the ad has paid for years. Not to mention, the current arrangement gives the ad, it gives the appearance that the BIF is nothing more than a shell in which rent is paid to the Bluegrass Industrial Foundation. And what's interesting about the Bluegrass Industrial Foundation is that a former executive director of the ad draws a salary as a landlord, which is a real conflict of interest. The exam found that the ad is the fiscal agent for the Workforce Investment Board and that the ad chair serves as both the chief elected officer and appoints the members to the Workforce Investment Board. I believe this is clearly a conflict of interest, and it appears that the ad was trying to strategically position itself to increase its authority over Workforce Investment Act funding. I would point out that the new leadership at the ad has been serious about resolving this important conflict of interest, and I believe is doing so. The exam found several other significant concerns. Auditors discovered that the ad was not using federal grant money properly. It would spend money, draw down reimbursements from whichever grant they chose, and would simply worry about the accounting later. Non-compliance with federal grant requirements is a serious problem and could jeopardize program funding into the future and increase the risk of error and misappropriation. Questionable oversight of financial activities was identified as a problem. The ad purchased property on Trent Boulevard for over $600,000, but the former director sought approval for the purchase from a friendly ad committee rather than from the executive committee of the Development District. He frequently conducted business this way, in conflict with the Development District's own bylaws. Auditors also found that the ad violated its own procurement policies. At the Trent Boulevard property, for example, it paid a local HVAC vendor nearly $500,000 without a bid process, without a written contract or documentation describing services to be performed or an estimate of the cost. It was simply a blank check. It had no invoices to support $63,000 worth of additional payments to that vendor, and the HVAC company is owned and operated by a member of the Workforce Investment Board, creating what is at the very least a substantial appearance of conflict of interest. Auditors questioned more than $500,000 in spending, mostly by the former director, that either lacked supporting documentation or appeared unnecessary or excessive. Examples of egregious spending include meals in or around Lexington, travel for individuals who were not affiliated with the Development District, travel expenses beyond what was required for conference attendance, hotel charges for stays in the same town as an employee's workstation. The exam also found that the former executive director was paid a $20,000 lump sum reimbursement without providing receipts, detailed credit card statements, or other support to justify the changes. You'll see right here, and I think there's no better illustration of what went wrong with the ad district and the approach of the former leader than this. This is simply a letter from the former executive director to committee members stating that he felt like he hadn't been adequately reimbursed over a 20-year period. So he simply says, "I think you owe me $20,000. Folks, I don't know what's more shocking, the fact that we had a leader in place in such an important public entity who had the nerve to ask for $20,000, or the fact that it was approved. That's deeply disconcerting, and I think it represents a governing culture that we can no longer tolerate in such an important and large public institution. We just can't have this. And I would point out that this reimbursement, lump sum reimbursement for expenses accrued allegedly over a 20-year period, this was in addition to a travel allowance that the former executive director had annually. It was in addition to, monthly. It was in addition to an expense account that the former executive director enjoyed. This was just a $20,000 lump sum with no pretense of documentation and not a scintilla of accountability. Auditors identified year-end bonuses paid to selected employees despite a prohibition against bonuses paid to public employees by the Kentucky Constitution. Bonuses were funded with federal grants intended for specific programs, and the ad created a fake pay period to support the bonuses, in clear violation of the mandates laid down by those who make federal grants. The exam also found that the ad used an outdated accounting system that only the former executive director knew how to fully operate. The lack of segregation of duties created a significant fraud risk for the agency. Now let me be clear. A system was designed, and I would call it a system of design incompetence, to make sure that only the former executive director dollars. That despite employees within the agency who had either financial oversight or administration in their title. At the end of the day, this was a one-man show. And we need look no further than a couple of weeks of work by our auditors in Covington, where a similar lack of segregation of resources resulted in a city controller being able to embezzle nearly $800,000. This report paints a disturbing picture of an institution that viewed serving the public as secondary to serving itself. Management deluded itself into thinking it could make up its own rules and be accountable to no one. I am hopeful that the new ad leadership will continue making the changes and heed the recommendations of this report. This agency handles a significant amount of taxpayer dollars, and as such, the public trust must be restored. I'm ready for questions.
Any indication that the current director knew what was going on with his predecessor before he alerted?
It was the issue we have here is that you had this design system of incompetence, and what it did was it empowered those at the top with the knowledge they needed to make determinations about the organization. The notion that this was anything other than an executive-driven organization is utter hogwash. The notion that this was a board-driven organization, frankly, as all public institutions ought to be board-driven. This one was not. You had systems in place that prevented effective oversight. You had you had board members not only on the ad board but on its appendages serving in positions when they were not even aware of that they were serving. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. So when you have that much power consolidated into such a small area, that's when you see abuses. And frankly, it's amazing that this ad district, which does significant work in the counties every day, was able to function. And the ultimate indictment of the system is that the former executive director had to be brought back in after his dismissal to explain how the system worked.
Is there anything in this that's new that we haven't seen in the pattern of problems with KCO, KLC, and other agencies?
The sophistication and the intricate nature of the system that permitted this kind of abuse is new. In the cases of KCO and the League of Cities in the past, I think what we largely saw were people who just forgot their mission. In this one, I think there was a concerted effort by the most recent executive director and the one before him to design their own empire that would run for their benefit rather than for the benefit of the 17 counties and all the taxpayers there within that they were supposed to serve.
Is there a possibility that any of these federal grant dollars will be recalled by the federal government?
I don't think there's any question, and that's why we've made the referral. Certainly, the ad, to their credit, under the new leadership is working aggressively to correct the mistakes they've made. But certainly, this kind of abuse opens us up to the federal government to make right, and I certainly hope that doesn't happen. But the sins of the past, the bill will come due. And the problem with these kind of abuses is that they jeopardize future federal funding, and they also invite an obligation that we may have to pay back. And when I talk about these appendage organizations, folks, you can't imagine just on the face of it how far outside the scope of their work they got. For instance, the Regional Recycling Corporation has done some very good work. I don't dispute that. But as a result of the ad district needing to find a place to plug federal money, the recycling corporation got into the culinary business. Now, I would submit to you, my goodness, what regional recycling corporation doesn't need its own food component? That's just how far away we got from the core mission of this organization. And I think it draws a powerful distinction between just how far out of line they got. And it's certainly going to be the responsibility of the new leadership at the ad and a rejuvenated and reasserted board to really get in and clean up the mess.
You talk about the board, there's a lot of lack of oversight, but is there, when you talk about charges being filed, do you think any board members who were there in the past and let all this happen, are they going to be affected at all?
You
Or
know,
should they be?
Certainly I think we all have responsibilities when we serve on an oversight board. But when you have executive leadership that is empowered to bypass relevant committees of the ad to go to more friendly committees, when the executive committee can be bypassed on something as important as a large real estate transaction, I think that's indicative of an organization that in no way, shape, or form was board driven. The abuses were driven for the top down. Those who were making decisions were largely insulated from everyone else. This was a board system. The way it was organized is in the way it developed over the years was in a manner that created nothing more than a rubber stamp board. When an executive can ignore their executive committee, you have big problems, and that's the kind of organization we had here. And I think there was so much churn over the years and the different board members coming on and going off that when you see that kind of change on a board, what it does is it strengthens the executive. And certainly what we had in the form of Mr. Seacon and Mr. Stoltz is that they became the institutions within the institution, and they were unlimited in their decision-making power.
Isn't there still some onus on the board then? If I'm on an executive committee, my executive director, who works for me, is doing this around, what then comes back to that board?
Well, I think what comes to the board is that they now very seriously and aggressively have to restore the public trust. And the only way they can do that is by making the board's role in the organization preeminent. We cannot ever get back to the position of one person being so powerful that they can single-handedly direct and abuse the mission of a $24.5 million organization.
Just to be clear on these appendages, as you referred to them, are you recommending they be lopped off or just firewalls be put up?
Well, I think that the board needs to make decisions about whether they're going to lop them off or whether they're going to build firewalls, but they need to do one or the other.
What would you recommend?
Well, my recommendation is that the ad district needs to get back into the business of focusing on what its core mission is as a means to promote and protect whatever public reputation it has left. Make no mistake, this is a turnaround job, and this ad district has been run into the ground by the self-interest of its leadership for a generation or two now. And the people who are on the board who now have a clear sense of what is precisely going on, they're going to be measured ultimately by how effectively and how quickly they move to deal with the issues that we've been able to inventory. No one now has a legitimate excuse for inaction based on that they don't know. What's in this report is a soup to nuts evaluation of the structural issues and integrity issues that have been the focus of the senior leadership of the ad district for some time.
We're 6-7 years now from where we first began with looking at our boards here in Central Kentucky. Do you think we're at a point now that these board members understand their responsibilities, or are there still executives that are pushing too much of an organization?
You know, I think sometimes you have to make people feel the heat before they will see the light. And I think after the litany of abuses that have been uncovered not only by my administration but my predecessors, I don't think anybody now can lay back on their laurels and say, well, it's the job of an organization to be run by its executive leadership. The job of executive leaders is to implement a vision instituted by the board and to be fully aware that they're being evaluated by the board. And what we have seen far too often, in my view, is the inverted pyramid, where you've got the where you've got the wrong people at the top and the many are being ignored. Susan?
Attorney General Ben Chandler did an investigation in 1995. Did you review that before you did your investigation and find the same problems, or had they been remedied in the last 10 years?
Well, I think some have been remedied and some have not. We certainly did go back and review that for historical context. But the issues identified by our organization or by my administration as auditor are I think going to be more catalytic in that the public imagination I think has been captured on this issue. I think there are a number of folks who understand that the ad district is present in every community in Central Kentucky, but I do not think that previous investigations have built the case for systemic reform that we have. I would submit to you that the folks who've gone and served on the board now have a different mission than the one they had that they originally thought that they were getting into, and I hope and expect it's one that they take very seriously. But the proof will be in the pudding. And let me remind you that any entity that is audited or investigated by my office has a 60-day opportunity to file their response. And this is the action plan they're taking in terms of their progress towards implementing the recommendations and the changes that we're frankly demanding. And I look forward to seeing that in a couple of months and working very closely with the ad to do everything we can to make sure that they are implemented.
Obviously, transparency has been an issue, but in the future, who truly would have oversight of all of the area development districts to make sure this does not happen in other locations? Well,
you'll not be surprised that I've gotten a lot of questions from the other ad districts around the state. Certainly, I don't think it would be fair to paint too broadly with a brush here. I've had nowhere near complaints about other ad districts that we found that we had here in Central Kentucky. And beyond that, I would point out that there was an awful lot of merit to the smoke, and the reputation of the ad district, the spot that it's in is one that's earned. And I think the good folks who are taking over now are going to do what they can to try to restore that. George?
Adam, your predecessor, Kurt Llewellyn, after she concluded the Bluegrass Airport investigation, created what many believe or look at as the Bible on board reform. Was there any indication during your review that the current board or previous board members had taken into account the work that Kurt Llewellyn had done and began to look at their organization based on her findings and recommendations?
Well, the 32 recommendations of effective board government I think are an awfully important tool for anybody who's in the public space. But George, you have to understand that for a board to have the ability to reform itself means that it has to have the power. And I hope what's crystal clear from my remarks today is that in no way, shape, or form was the board in any way positioned to be adequate in their oversight. This isn't just a failure of integrity integrity or the character of the people at the top of this organization. This is a failure of system. When a leader has the ability to ignore their bylaws and take significant decision-making action to a friendly committee within an organization rather than the executive committee, you have an awfully big problem, and that's what we've got now. So I would argue that going forward, certainly the new board and the way it constituted itself will want to focus on the 32 recommendations for effective board governance. But the first thing it has to do is take the power to implement those, because the notion that any one board member, or frankly any majority of that board, could have stopped these sorts of things, didn't bear out in our examination.
Couldn't a majority of a board stop it by firing an executive director?
Sure they could, but they weren't empowered to do that, because you didn't have, if you go back and you look at the minutes of the board, they weren't being shared information. Frankly, you had a lot of board members who first became aware of how deeply ingrained their issues were by the reporting at the Herald Leader. When you have people who are on boards as a position that they're unaware of, or that you have executive committees and boards that are as big as these are, what you get is zero accountability. And in this system, you had zero accountability. When the executive director is in a system where he can ignore any board member concerns, that's a real problem. There certainly were members of the board who raised these issues. They were just summarily ignored. And that's because the power rested with the individual rather than with the collective.
So the mayor and I sat in a board meeting early 2012 when they first started talking about the purchase of the property on Trent Boulevard. And one of his board members on the executive committee asked him how much money he spent on the property, $600,000. How much did he put into the property? And when he said $500,000, the majority of that committee did not know that he spent that much money. He was approved to spend $200,000. So at what point, when it became clear in a public meeting that the executive director spent $300,000 more than he was authorized to spend, would you expect that the board start to look into what's going on?
There's no question, they absolutely should have. But keep in mind that the executive director didn't take the authority to do what he did on Trent Boulevard from his executive committee. He took it from a more friendly committee inside the organization. And when a leader is empowered to do that, it results in disastrous consequences. In the Trent Boulevard property, for instance, the $600,000 purchase price, $500,000 investment, that $500,000 worth of upgrade not bidded, not documented, none of the above. And now the result is I think that property is being sold at a list price for well under what?
About what they paid for it.
About what they have in it. That's inexcusable.
No, about what they paid for it, not what they have in it.
Well, it's 600. Yeah, that's exactly right. 600,000 purchase price, $500,000 in it, 1.1 I think altogether. And I think the property is for sale somewhere less than 900,000. I mean, that's a real loss, George, to the taxpayers.
Right.
No question about it. Sir.
What gives you confidence that there can be internal reform? Because we haven't seen it, and this has been going on since 1995. I'm concerned about that.
Well, for one, I'm present now, and the taxpayer watchdog is one who knows how to wield an axe handle. I assure you that. They have 60 days to get their house in order to my satisfaction. I will be working very closely with them to make sure that they get to the appropriate result. And if you haven't noticed, when I open my mouth, people tend to show up. And this is not an issue I'm going to leave. And I also don't throw grenades. So what I hope happens as a result of this report is that it becomes a document that's catalytic and that it spurs better government. And I think what we're going to get out of the ad district is a substantially better run area development district. But if we don't, I'll be back. And let me also say that it's not just my presence. We have the presence of law enforcement. We have had briefings with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This is going to happen. And I believe that those who have committed misdeeds in the past will be held to account. But I also believe that there needs to be a clean break with the past. And it's the opportunity that the new leadership has in the ad is to provide that clean break, but they have to demonstrate that they're different.
The original director formed a group, an association for area development district directors of all of the ad districts. Does that continue to operate?
Susan, that's way outside the scope of this investigation. We were not here to investigate any one person. We were here to investigate a broken culture in an organization that's extraordinarily important. And I think what we need to focus on is making sure that the ad district improves, that the people of Central Kentucky get the investment, they get the return on their investment. But the individuals who have abused their trust, I have no doubt will be called to account. I think that begins with this report, and I think it now rests in the hands of law enforcement. Thank you very much.